So with that, I'd like to welcome our panelists from our first session, focusing on the impacts of increasing coastal water levels. Our presenters include Dan Rizza, Tiffany Troxler, and Brian McNoldy. So if you all wouldn't mind coming towards the stage. And thank you, Wendy, again. Dan Rizza leads the program on sea level rise at Climate Central, directing it to equipping coastal stakeholders with the tools, information, and products necessary to understand, communicate, visualize, and respond to sea level rise and coastal flooding. He earned his master's degree from Georgetown University's Graduate School of Foreign Service and his bachelor's from Colby College. Dr. Tiffany Troxler is the Associate Professor in the Department of Earth and Environment and the Director of Science in the Sea Level Solution Center in the Institute of University in Miami, Florida. She holds a bachelor's degree in anthropology and biological sciences, as well as a master's and doctorate, all from Florida International University. Brian McNoldy is the Senior Research Associate at the University of Miami's Rosenthal School of Marine, Atmospheric, and Earth Science, where his focus is primarily tropical cyclone research as well as sea level rise and extreme heat. He has a BA in Physics and Astronomy from Lycoming College and William A. Master's in Atmospheric Science from Colorado State University. Again, the Menti is open for you to answer questions. They're going to be looking at those questions at the end of the presentation and self-selecting the questions, restating them, and answering them as time allows. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan to start us off. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. Today I'll be talking about the impacts of increasing coastal water levels with key takeaways from NOAA's 2022 Sea Level Rise Technical Report and its companion, the Application Guide. I'll also be referencing content from the IPCC and other NOAA resources and show examples from tools to make these concepts more tangible. As Jennifer mentioned, I work at Climate Central. We're based in Princeton, New Jersey. We're a non-advocacy, non-profit. I'm surrounded by scientists, software developers, and other communicators as well. So it's a privilege to be here in at the Southwest Florida Resilience Summit. So let's get started. If I can move the slide forward. So why do rising coastal water levels matter for Florida? Coastal water levels are rising, and Florida stands out as one of the most vulnerable states. You've likely felt the impact one way or another. Hurricanes and coasts in many parts of the state, vulnerability assessments and resiliency planning are already underway. There's a lot going on in Florida. We have driven along the entire coastline, and it's really impressive what's going on here. And here we're looking at Climate Central's maps, which show land projected to be below the level of a 10-year flood by 2050. But our tool lets us explore a range of scenarios from tidal flooding alone to annual floods to 100-year flood levels, all based on the U.S. Interagency NOAA's 2022 technical report. So this is a screening level tool. It's meant to give you a sense of the exposure broadly. But I understand, I know this region is fortunate to have access to other resources and tools that go deeper, providing localized data and analysis for planning. So my goal today is to break down the basics of rising water levels and flooding dynamics, setting the stage for the detailed technical presentations you'll hear later on today. Flooding doesn't disrupt life. From getting kids to school or keeping businesses open, repeated floods hurt property values and drive up insurance costs. As homes lose value, counties lose property tax revenue, meaning less funding for schools, roads, and emergency services. The National Climate Assessment warns that in the southeast part of the U.S., the combined effects of sea level rise and extreme rainfall are already increasing flood frequencies, and without significant adaptation measures, the region is projected to experience daily high tide flooding. That's the scale of the challenge here in Florida. Our sinking tax base report shows that repeated coastal flooding doesn't just affect homeowners, it threatens the fiscal health of local governments. So as property values could potentially decline, so do tax revenues, which are the primary sources for all these things that I've mentioned, infrastructure, schools, et cetera. You may have already seen the signs of water bubbling through storm drains on sunny days. Tide gauges confirm what we're seeing. Sea levels are rising. Along the U.S. coastlines, water levels have risen about 10 to 12 inches over the last century. This means that what you're experiencing in your neighborhoods is part of a larger pattern. High tide flooding events that used to be rare are now happening more often in many parts of the country, and they're going to become more common in the decades ahead in many places. Back in the year 2000, communities saw about 2 days per year on average. By 2020, that had already doubled to about 4 days a year, and by 2050, we're looking at 5 days a year, and that's 19 times as frequent as today. So these sunny day floods don't require a storm. They can still cause real problems, flooding streets, stressing roads, sewers, and draining systems, and disrupting access to schools, workplaces, and businesses. Stormwater systems here are gravity-based, so pipes are built to let water flow downhill into canals or the harbor. So when harbor water is too high, the system, instead of flowing out, the water sits in pipes or even reverses. That's why water sometimes bubbles up through storm drains after storms or high tides, or during high tides. It's not because the city forgot to clean them, it's gravity. Water can't flow downhill if the exit is already underwater. And when you have high tides at the same time as rainfall or other flood events, it's more difficult for the drainage systems to function since water is already in the pipes. So let's start with the big picture. Here are the main drivers of global oceans warm. Oceans are warming, and that means that they're expanding. Glaciers worldwide are melting, and Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets are contributing. And in some regions, the land itself is moving. So I'll walk through these one by one, starting with thermal expansion, which has historically been the largest single contributor. So when water warms, it takes up more space. No new water is added, but the volume expands. Think of that swells up. This process, thermal expansion, has been the single biggest driver of global sea level rise so far. You can see it here. The expansion from ocean warming contributed more than any other factor. But that's not the only story. Let's look at melting glaciers and ice sheets. Around the world, mountain glaciers are shrinking. The top photos show Muir Riggs glaciers in a retreat between 1941 and 2004. That's what's happening across so many places across the globe, with glaciers steadily adding water to the oceans. I recall visiting Glacier National Park in Montana years ago, seeing how the glaciers had shrunk, and I'm sure they're shrinking further. A larger concern is with Greenland and Antarctica. The second image shows Antarctica, home to many significant outlet glaciers. These are glaciers that flow from the ice sheet on land. Their speed and stability will determine how much ice Antarctica contributes to future water level rise. When I first began working in this field, in my previous job, I remember working with glaciologists who were studying the acceleration of Greenland's outlet glaciers, in some cases moving 3 to 4 times faster than before. So we were reading scientific papers back there in 2007 or so and briefing congressional committees on what appeared to be the new trajectory for rising water levels. Antarctica's glaciers are the largest, the future of our coastlines, and water levels depend to a large degree on how fast these glaciers deteriorate, melt, and flow into the ocean. Greenland holds enough ice to raise seas by 25 feet and combined with Antarctica more than 200 feet. So that's a lot of ice. We'd prefer to stay on land. It does take time for ice to disintegrate and melt, however, which gives us time to monitor and plan. Rising water levels, they're not just about the ocean rising, it's also about the land, what the land is. NOAA refers to this as vertical land motion, which explains why relative sea level rise varies across regions. Along the Gulf Coast, the land is sinking or subsiding due to local factors like sediment compaction and groundwater pumping, as well as large-scale effects from the last ice age. Back then, massive ice sheets in the north pressed the continent down, creating a bulge in the south. As the ice melted, the north rebounded upward, tilting the Gulf region downward. This double impact, rising makes relative sea level rise faster here than the global average, amplifying flood risks for local communities. So how do we know the waters are rising? Satellites track global ocean heights and warming. Tide gauges confirm the same rise at local scales. And we know one of the primary drivers, such as carbon dioxide, these levels are climbing steeply, and the oceans are following. The science is robust and confirmed by multiple lines of evidence. A common misconception of a rise happens evenly, like filling a bathtub, but Earth doesn't work like that way. You've got these massive ice sheets, those in Greenland or in Antarctica. They actually pull nearby water toward them due to their gravitational pull. When the ice melts, its gravitational influence weakens, and that originally attracted water moves away. That means nearby water levels can even fall, or while far away, like the Gulf of Mexico, sea levels are more than the global average. Magnet in the ocean, attracting water towards it. As the magnet shrinks, the pull fades, and the water moves outward. That's why sea level rise creates a distinct fingerprint pattern, different places can see different changes, and that explains part of the reason why waters are rising here faster than in other places. According to NOAA's 2022 technical report, U.S. coasts are expected to see 10 to 12 inches of rise by 2050, the same amount we saw over the last century, but that rise is essentially locked in. What that means is that every tide and every storm surge in the decades ahead will be riding in on top of this higher baseline. NOAA notes that this will lead to a shift in U.S. coastal flood regimes, with events that used to consider moderate becoming far more frequent. And we're already seeing that shift. Floods that used to be rare are now happening regularly, and research shows that many of them wouldn't even occur without this is a study we did a while back showing the coastal flood days since the 1950s. The blue bars are the floods that would have happened naturally, and the orange bars are floods made possible from human-caused sea level rise. But by the 2000s, more than 3/4 of the so-called nuisance floods were already attributable to human influence. So the human fingerprint isn't just about the future, it's already clear in today's flood data. Here's a technical report. When you start with that higher baseline, even routine storms take on new power. You've got surge, waves, rainfall, and river flow, and they all stack on top of elevated water levels. Hurricanes add another layer. Remember, they also dump rain far inland. A day or two later, after a storm has passed the coastline, that water can flow downstream to coastal areas, causing more flooding days later. Together, these overlapping factors, and it's why today's moderate storms can now can now create even more damage than before. And you can see it in NOAA's schematic here. Flooding exposure isn't just about rising waters alone, it's the combination. Storm surge is pushed up by strong winds, waves crashing on top, rainfall arriving, sewer swelling, groundwater rising, and land can sink. So according to their technical report, it's this combination of rising seas and other coastal flood factors that's the exposure of impacts that we face. And the impacts are clear. Hurricanes like Ian and Milton struck with extra water from these increased water levels, amplifying their damage. We actually did a study at Climate Central several years ago regarding Hurricane Sandy and found analysis that showed about $8 billion in additional damage that came from higher seas, letting surge push further inland. So rising seas takes existing flood problems and makes them worse. Useful tools out there that dig into this. So for your community's numbers, NOAA has a great tool called the NOAA Sea Level Calculator that shows how flood frequencies can shift at each tide gauge. So this graphic is from the closest tide gauge to this location in their tool in Fort Myers. So historically, you can see high tide flooding here was rare, less than 1 day per year in the 1980s. In the last decade, that average has doubled to about 2 to 4 days per year. And looking ahead, we see that sharp increase to hundreds of days per year, depending on the emissions and sea level scenarios. So what used to be an occasional inconvenience is on track to become a regular disruption to roads, businesses, and daily life, even without storms. Coastal wetlands provide critical protection and services. They can absorb floodwaters, buffer storm surge, slow erosion, filter water, and much more. I think we're going to have other presentations on it. They're one of our most valuable natural defenses. But rising water levels puts wetlands at risk. If seas rise too quickly, wetlands can drown because they can't build up sediment fast enough. At the same time, seawalls and coastal development block them from moving inland. So without room to migrate, wetlands can shrink, and so does their ability to protect our communities. So this map is from one of our tools that shows what it looks like right here in Charlotte Harbor by the year 2100 under a survey. The light green areas show where current coastal wetlands exist. Darker green areas show where new wetlands might form if land is left undeveloped, and blue and purple areas show where today's wetlands could be lost to open water as the water levels increase. So what we're seeing is a trade-off. Without space to move inland, wetlands could disappear, and when they disappear, we lose that front line of defense against flooding, storm surge, and erosion. NOAA summarized from their report. I'm passing them along to you here. So near term, just to repeat some of what I've said before, we're essentially looking at 10 to 12 inches of sea level rise by 2050, the same change we saw over the last century, but compressed into 30 years. So this means more extreme tides, more damaging storm surges, and flooding that's expected to be 10 times more frequent than today. Looking out further, emissions matter. With current emissions, we're looking to see at least 2 feet of additional rise by 20, much more, up to 7 feet if unstable ice sheets accelerate. We have high confidence in the next 30 years. After the 2050 range, the possibilities really grow much wider, depending on our emissions and also the sensitivity of the ice sheets and other variables. So the bottom line is what we do now will shape the long-term future. According to their technical report, higher seas don't just flood the streets, they infiltrate groundwater aquifers with salt. They can affect water quality, stormwater and wastewater systems. For communities, this means wells can become too salty to drink without costly treatment, and farmland can be damaged. Even small increases in increasing water levels can tip the balance, contaminating fresh supplies. So this is a reminder that resilience isn't only about what's visible above the ground, it's also about protecting the water resources underground. So NOAA put together this useful application guide as a compare. I recommend you check it out. It helps communities figure out how to use the projections in their planning. Every place is different, so there isn't one single path forward. There are a lot of resilience experts in the room. They're going to be presenting later on about this. But what this guide does is it outlines some strategies communities can lean on. So first, the risk tolerance approach, deciding how much risk your community can live with. Second, the scenario-based planning, preparing for multiple plausible futures since we can't know exactly how. And third, adaptation pathways, thinking in terms of phasing actions over time so you can adjust as conditions change. And importantly, it emphasizes the need to engage in local stakeholders to make sure that plans reflect community needs and priorities. So to sum up, coastal water levels are rising, and here in Florida, that means more frequent flooding, stress on infrastructure, and challenges for ecosystems and communities. The science is clear. We anticipate about a foot of rise by 2050, and what happens beyond that and how quickly these ice sheets respond. NOAA's application guide reminds us that communities can plan by deciding how much risk you can live with, preparing for a range of possible futures, phasing actions so you can adjust over time, and engaging local stakeholders so plans reflect real needs. So the takeaway is that while we can't stop the seas from water levels from rising in the near future, we can choose how we prepare and how resilient we'll be. And that's why summits like this one are so useful. So thank you, and I look forward to the discussions that will follow.
Great. Hello. Good morning. Great to see everyone. Thanks so much for the invitation to speak today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about wetland ecosystems and their potential for adapting to levels, in particular sea level rise and the other factors that contribute to adaptive capacity of coastal wetlands. So we think about coastal wetlands, coastal ecosystems. Almost, I'm sure, everyone in this room has had the opportunity to interact with them, either through boating activities, diving, maybe even studying, or contributing to their protection and their restoration. And naturally adaptive, they have the capacity to adjust to changes in environmental conditions. It is a natural key factor that contributes to their development. And so over a period of time in which sea level was quite low, or the change in sea level was quite low, this is on approximately over 2,000, increasing at about 8 inches at that rate, was the period in which coastal wetlands developed. And this process is referred to as progradation. So they're increasing vertically and they're expanding laterally, associated with a low rate of change in sea level over time. And so that slow buildup of coastal wetlands is associated also with organic soil, otherwise known as peat. The peat soil is formed from healthy plants, the growth of healthy plants producing the growth of healthy roots, and that root material senesces and dies as plants turn over, they grow, they die. And that material is what comprises the peat soils. And because those soils are waterlogged, which induces a low rate of decay of that root material, which is primarily contributing to that peat. And then because plants are constantly seeking areas of slightly higher oxygen, they're also increasing vertically, which enables the wetland elevation, the wetland surface to also increase vertically. And this is a process that has led to a lot of carbon being stored below ground, demonstrating that coastal wetlands are hotspots of carbon dioxide sequestration, as they're able to sequester larger amounts of carbon in certain conditions than some tropical forests. And so in addition to this carbon dioxide mitigation ecosystem services that coastal wetlands have, they also contribute to a number of other coastal ecosystem services that we all rely on, helping to mitigate pollutants from entering our waterways, contributing to healthy commercial and recreational fishing industry, buffering the impacts of storms, so contributing to coastal protection, and then also contributing to a really important recreational and tourism industry here in Florida. So, as I mentioned, coastal wetlands are naturally adaptive, is changing faster than the conditions under which coastal wetlands developed. And that accompanying that change, that rapid change in sea level is also changes in salinity, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But in the past, as Dan described for us also, we've seen about a foot of change in sea level over the last 100 years, and the rate is accelerating, where in the last 15 years, we've seen about another of that change over the last 100 years. So compared to the conditions under which coastal wetlands developed, we're seeing unprecedented rates, or those wetlands are seeing unprecedented rates of sea level change. And we're currently planning for approximately 2 more feet of sea level, that projection depending on the rate of sea level change, but actively planning for up to another 2 feet over the next 50, which suggests that coastal wetlands may have a difficult time adapting to those changes in sea level in the future. And so over the last 10 years or so, we've been studying the vulnerability of coastal wetlands. And one of those phenomena that we've been exploring is called peat collapse. And this is defined as a relatively rapid shift in soil carbon balance, leading to a net loss of organic carbon, culminating in a conversion of vegetated marsh to open water ponds. And you can see this from a bird's eye view as a sort of pock-marked pattern within a otherwise relatively homogeneous marsh system. And one of the complicating factors associated with this transition from a vegetated marsh to open water is that it contributes to continue to prograde, build vertically and laterally if water levels are too deep for those mangroves to get established. And another issue associated with another factor that contributes to the vulnerability of coastal wetlands, not only in the Everglades, but in other watersheds where water is being appropriated where fresh water is being appropriated for other uses, salinity, and an increase in soil salinity in areas that where wetlands have been adapted to freshwater conditions. And so with increasing sea level and a freshwater diversion away from the coastline, either through groundwater or surface water, that increasing salinization can also contribute to the degradation of coastal wetlands. So there's, at the time there was significant uncertainty, in particular in the case of the Everglades system, where it was uncertain as to how coastal wetlands, whether they would be able to adapt naturally to changes in sea level without the reintroduction of fresh water into the Everglades, looking like a pretty dire situation for coastal wetland given changes in sea level that were projected in the case that freshwater delivery is not restored. And this became an important question for the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Program, which is regularly reviewed by the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine Committee on the Independent Scientific Review of Everglades Restoration. What are what do that coastal wetlands can continue to adapt with changes in sea level? And what are the implications for the Everglades Restoration Program? Coastal wetlands, as I mentioned, naturally adaptive, but the conditions of sea level change now are unprecedented relative to when these wetlands developed. And we've been trying to understand coastal wetland vulnerability in the context of understanding the adaptive capacity of these wetlands, understanding their exposure to different stressors like increasing water levels in some cases and increasing soil salinization, and then how sensitive those plants are to those different factors that contribute to their vulnerability. But understanding more about how we can promote their adaptive capacity can overall reduce. And these are some of the questions that we've been exploring as part of the National Science Foundation funded Florida Coastal Everglades long-term ecological research program. And what I'm showing there on the right, this graphic is through field observations and experiments, tracking plant growth and carbon storage, and understanding how that changes with regard to different presses and pulses that either help to promote the development of those plants as well as their carbon storage, or make them more vulnerable to different factors. We're working to understand and be able to predict the trajectory of those wetlands using those types of measurements and experiments as to whether the trajectory of those wetlands are developing, where the plant growth is exceeding that's being emitted into the atmosphere, or declining, which is a situation in which the vulnerability of those wetlands is increasing. And so some of those observations and monitoring, we use eddy flux towers, which capture carbon dioxide and other gases coming off a mangrove forest, for example, to try to understand whether those wetlands are a sink for carbon, or we measure wetland elevation change using surface elevation tables so that we can monitor the change in wetland elevation over time at specific sites. And we also make field observations of above ground and below ground plant growth that help us to track the health of those wetlands and their contributions to carbon storage, and then also monitoring some of those factors over the long term and continuously. So I'll just highlight two mangrove studies that were designed to try to assess the resilience of some of mangroves within the Everglades. So on the left-hand side, what I'm showing is a figure that illustrates the observed carbon that's being sequestered in prairie. So this is a marsh system that's been exposed to a soil salinization. And what you see there is that what's been observed in terms of the carbon that marsh system is sequestering is well below what we should expect given changes in water level. And so this is expressed as a climate debt, meaning that that marl system, or that prairie, that marsh, that marl marsh is not operating at its optimum relative to what we would expect from carbon sequestration, and that is in a response to increasing water levels. And then below, the scrub mangrove on the left-hand side, the light green, this is the same approach, also focused on scrub mangroves. And what you see is that the observed carbon sequestration is approximating, given its exposure to water levels, illustrating that scrub mangroves, given the change in water level, are more resilient to those changes in water level. And then on the right-hand side, this is a paper that monitored carbon sequestration of a scrub mangrove system and what we refer to as a riverine or a tall mangrove system, illustrating that recovered the same level of carbon that it was accumulating prior to the storm, even within just 1 year after the impact of that storm. The tall forest took a little bit longer to recover, but those scrub mangroves are really performing quite amazingly. And then we also conduct experiments, different types of experiments where we can control the levels of salinity or water level or nutrients that different types of coastal ecosystems are exposed to, so that we can understand thresholds of their growth based on different types of environmental conditions, doing that both in field experiments and what we call outdoor mesocosm experiments. And so we combine the field observations with the experimental results and incorporate that into ecosystem modeling frameworks. So for example, here we're trying to simulate the ecosystem trajectory of different coastal wetlands, and this one is focused on a peat-forming marsh within the Everglades, where we use that information to try to simulate the ecosystem trajectory. And for example, when our field observations match what we see in those computer models, that we're able to verify the performance of that computer model, and then we can use that computer model to enter in information about changes in nutrients or changes in water level, changes in salinity, and have a fairly good understanding of what the trajectory of that coastal wetland would be given those variable conditions. And then one other study in line computer models, this one's called the Coastal Wetland Equilibrium Model. And what you see on the left is a simulation of a scrub mangrove that is vegetated and at a certain wetland elevation. And then on the right-hand side, you see a scrub mangrove with a low cover of vegetation at a lower elevation. And what those lines are illustrating, level rise scenarios, is that the wetland becomes submerged with the highest rates of sea level change, only with the highest rates of sea level change, when those mangroves are at a higher wetland elevation and they're vegetated. But what we see when those wetlands are at a lower elevation with poor vegetation cover, that all sea level scenarios illustrate that wetland will become submerged for that. Helping to describe the environmental conditions in which those mangroves will not do very well with the rapid changes in coastal water levels that we're seeing. And so our next steps are to conduct another experiment. So this one is called the Mangrove Experimental Manipulation Exercise, or MIMI. And so this experiment is to try to evaluate in a experiment an approach that's referred to as thin layer placement. And so this is a way that we can explore how we can jumpstart adaptive capacity of coastal wetlands by increasing the sediment elevation of those wetlands and looking at other factors like mangrove planting density. So if we plant out those wetlands at a higher mangrove planting density, will that help to kickstart its ability levels? And then also using low levels of nutrients to promote growth. And so in this experiment, we're assessing adaptive capacity by evaluating the change in wetland elevation relative to sea level change. And if we see that wetland elevation is increasing relative to sea level change, we're seeing a potential for an increased ability to adapt to changes in water level. Okay, so just to sum up, what we found is that there are cases where coastal wetlands are doing quite well adapting to changes in water levels, but it depends on the extant environmental conditions. And I'd just like to thank those funding sources. Thank you very much.
Brian is our virtual speaker next. He is out of state, so he is tuning in through Zoom, and I believe we are going over to that right now for him to give his presentation, correct?
We're ready when you are.
All right, I hear you. Now we just need to get the video up. All right, can you see?
Yes.
Wonderful. Feel free to go ahead. Thank you.
Actually, I'm seeing me again on there. I was seeing the first slide.
Oh, okay. Well, go back.
I think you might be on maybe the wrong window.
All right, we had it up.
There we go.
There we go. Thank you.
All right. Well, thankfully, an honor to be virtually sharing the stage with Dan and Tiffany, and the very interesting talks there. And I appreciate the opportunity to be part of the first session here. I know not being there in person is not as fun for sure, but at least I'm here. So I really appreciate the invitation. So let's go to the next slide, please. Just for a little bit of background of what I'll be talking about. Half-tide predictions made by NOAA now, they rely on a long time period of tide measurements made at each location. And there's a kind of a mathematical trick you can do that you can basically recreate lots of components. Oh, I just lost your shared screen, but you can create lots of components of what makes up those tides and basically reconstruct them. There we go. What's going on presently in the atmosphere or the ocean. You can make these many years in advance. NOAA creates these tide predictions for over 200 tide gauge locations in the US. And importantly, the vertical coordinate is updated approximately every 20 years. The current baseline for those tide predictions is 1983 to 2001. So, of course, as this crowd knows, since then, so tide predictions are chronically biased low because of that. But even after you correct for sea level rise, it's still really important if you can also adjust your tide forecast for what's currently going on in the atmosphere and ocean. Next slide, please. Here's an example from your nearby Fort Myers tide gauge. The blue curve, this is recently, this is August of 2025. The blue line shows the NOAA tide predictions at that location, and the green line shows what was actually observed. You can see pretty routinely, the tide predictions are indeed chronically biased low, and one component of that, a big component of that, is the constant sea level rise offset, but it's not always off by the same amount. So there are influences that are going on from one. Next slide, please. This is an example that I made for Virginia Key. This is the tide predictions for all of 2025. And I just added a sea level rise correction to it. So these tide predictions shown on this chart would be exactly what you would get from if you looked at the NOAA tide predictions, but add 7.4 inches, which is what I added for here, which is kind of a recent, like the past 3 years, if you take the average and then just kind of add that off. So a lot closer to the right answer of what will be observed in 2025, but there are still, of course, going to be some ups and downs that aren't predicted even when you do account for sea level rise. But it does kind of show throughout the year when we expect the highest tides of the year. And at this location, the highest predicted tide is coming up on October 8th. But that, of course, may not end up being the actual observed highest tide of the year. Next slide, please. So just a quick overview of what tide predictions are and what they aren't. As we saw on the Fort Myers example from two slides ago, it is pretty good in terms of capturing when the high tides happen. So that's great. You're often not going to get the right actual height right, but when high and low tides happen is very, very well tide predictions. But they're not like what we think of when we think of a weather forecast. They're basically just astronomical influences and climatology. And like I mentioned before, they can be made years in advance. So they absolutely don't know anything about current weather conditions or ocean conditions. So as anyone who lives on a coast, you know that observed water levels can be very different from tide predictions and create unexpected infrastructure problems. Next slide, please. Let's go over what we generally refer to as king tide season. For roughly 2 months, maybe 3, the water level in the region reaches its highest of the year, roughly mid-September through mid-November. That's shifted a little bit sooner on the West Coast, by about a month, and that's just due to the general conditions in the atmosphere and ocean. So that happens every year. And some of those non-astronomical influences that create king tide season are the average wind speed and direction, the ocean temperature, the atmospheric pressure, and ocean currents. And all of those have an average local influence, which actually is included in tide predictions. If you look at, there are two components of tide predictions that when you add them up, basically recreate what the average cycle looks like at each location. But as I mentioned, the actual current conditions are not accounted for. And we generally think of king tide season as a time of year with frequent and impactful nuisance flooding events. Next slide, please. So just to look at what this looks like at some tide gauges around South Florida. These are the average water levels by month at Virginia Key in red, Fort and Key West in blue. And I put a kind of a label there for what we roughly consider king tide season, when the water levels are just naturally at their highest point of the year. So no big uncertainty of why the fall is considered king tide season. That's just generally when they happen. So this is just what the average seasonal cycle looks like at these places. Next slide, please. This is an example from, it's a little hard to read on the slide here. I can bring up this was from September of 2024. It measured at Virginia Key, and this was just a photo taken of a street in the Miami region. And you can see no rain, pretty blue skies, and the street is completely flooded. And so we had very high tides there. And as we heard from Dan in the first tides, even if it's not quite to this extreme, it really does reduce or eliminate the ability of storm drains to drain water away when all your drains are already filled. So if you have rain on top of this, it's a very significant problem. Next slide, please. It also creates a challenge for the South Florida Water Management District, and I'm bringing them up for a reason that you'll see in a bit here. They have dozens of that are gravity fed. So you have what's called the headwater, which is the part of the control structure that is not facing the tides, and then you have the tailwater, which is basically the tides. And so when you have very high tides, these control structures need to be closed so you don't get salt water running upstream. And they're pretty hard to anticipate. So that's kind of where these quote unquote smart tide forecasts that I'll get to in a bit come in. Okay, next slide, please. So this is looking at monthly water levels and trends. This is basically sea level rise. And this is just over the past 20 years. Again, at Virginia Key, Fort Myers, and Key West. Sea level rise makes this nuisance flooding so severe. And it's not a gradual increase. Like I think we sometimes maybe think of each year just creeps up higher and higher. Some years are actually lower than the year before on average. And you can have even multiple years in a row that go down, but the trend is absolutely upward. No doubt about it. And when you average it across all of the tide gauges in South Florida, it's around 0.3 inches per year, with a little bit of a range or around that. Most certainly an upward trend. And it's the trend is increasing more in recent times. And there's a really amazing tide gauge record that we have at Key West that began in 1913. Next slide, please. So for this chart, what I did is I calculated the number of hours each year that the water level was above the mean high tide. Is again reference to the 1983 to 2001 mean high tide. So it's all being referenced to the same height. And that's in the red curve. In the blue curve is just the number of hours per year that the water level exceeded the minor flood threshold, which for a very long time really never happened. You can see that blue line is pretty much right on zero until recent years, where now it's definitely not at zero routinely. Interesting. So when you have this, 115-year-old tide record, it's really quite an amazing thing. And as it turns out, that's actually an exponential. An exponential curve fits that line extremely well. And even though it's not perfectly something I would want to extrapolate, too long into the future. But if you were to extrapolate that exponential curve, you reach the number 760. You reach that by about 2060. That exponential line that fits the red curve would basically mean you're spending all the time above mean high tide in an entire year, in another 35 years or so. Next slide, please. This is another way to look at the really amazing at Key West. 1913 is down at the bottom of the plot, and 2025 is up at the top. And then the months go left to right. So this is one colored bar each day during that entire period of record. And the color represents the number of hours per day that the water level spent above mean high tide. And this is just an amazing way, I think, to look at not only where king tide season is. You can see that in September, you generally do spend more time above mean high tide. But when you're going, if you look from the lower part of the plot to the top, that's where you're seeing sea level rise in action. The colors are becoming more warm more often throughout the year, especially during king tide season. So without sea level rise, you wouldn't see that trend looking from the lower part of the plot to the top. And there's absolutely a trend. Next slide, please. Okay, so how important sea level rise is and what's going on. I'm going to talk about these smart tide forecasts that we've been making. This began, the roots of this began in 2020. We started working on this, and it became a real-time product, updated each day, thanks to funding and collaboration with the South Florida Water Management District. We have absolutely enjoyed that and appreciate their continued interest. So we create 10-day tide forecasts that do account for current conditions in the atmosphere and the ocean at all the tide gauges across South Florida, and they're marked on the map on the right there. We begin with the NOAA tide predictions. We add a sea level rise adjustment to each location. Then we use 10-day forecasts from a few ocean and atmosphere environmental factors, weather models, in a multiple linear regression model. I'm not going to go into how it works, but so far it's working well. And it really is mostly designed for just the routine king tide flooding. If there's a hurricane about to make landfall, I would not rely on this for looking at how bad this storm surge will be. That is not what this is meant for. Next slide, please. So we have 4 different versions from different models that are available by 7 a.m. Eastern for all the sites. We do have some validation results that we looked at a year ago, and again, right now we're looking at some, and they do show that there's forecast skill persisting through all 10 days, which of course decreases with time. And there is, unfortunately, a little less skill on the West Coast compared to the East Coast, but it still has skill over just the NOAA plus sea level rise, kind of quick way of looking at the tide forecast. So that's kind of what our baseline is. So for this, I define skill as just being more accurate than simply adding a sea level rise correction to the NOAA tide predictions. Next slide, please. This is just a couple examples. You're not really necessarily meant to read all the numbers and everything on it, but these are examples from Virginia Key last, and these show basically the high and low tides through the next 10 days. The red line is the NOAA tide predictions. The orange line, which is a little hard to see on this version, is when you just add the sea level rise offset. And then the light blue line is what our tide forecast model has. And this is just one example of course, lots of days. But in this case, we have two pretty impactful days where the moderate flooding threshold, that red dashed line up there. And so the light blue line actually was really quite amazingly close to what was actually observed, which was significantly higher than if you had just been looking at the NOAA tide predictions. And then the two versions of this, we have one from the European model that things are based off of, and one is from the American model on the right. Next slide, please. This is just a different. We also run it off of their ensembles, which is when they run lots of different versions of the model to enable you to get kind of a bit of a spread of what could happen. And this is, instead of looking at all of the tide data each day with the high and low tides, this is just the peak each day, which when you're looking at the ensemble spread, which is the gray bars around the blue line, it makes it a little more clean, basically, to look at it this way. So that if you're just levels each day, this is probably the version you would be wanting to look at. So again, it's just the European model based forecast on the left and the American model based one on the right. Again, this did extremely well on a very impactful week going ahead. Next slide, please. So just to wrap up, these tide forecasts do offer skillful, actionable outlooks. Since going online in 2023, the forecasts are used by, of course, the South Florida Water Management District, but we've also heard from people in Miami-Dade County, Broward County, the National Weather Service in Miami, Tampa, and Key West, and then in Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Palm Beach. So we're extremely happy to hear that people are using these, and they do seem to be doing extremely well. I mean, of course, they're not always going to be spot on, but we're very happy with the results of these. Please. Okay, and just to wrap up, if you have any questions, if you want to look at these tide forecasts for yourself, the South Florida Water Management District on their Resilience Metrics Hub, there's a link there to go to that. I have the charts posted on my website as well. It's the same chart, so if you, you're not going to get anything special on one or the other, but the South Florida Water Management District Resilience Metrics Hub has a lot of great other I urge you to check that out. And then my contact information is there. Be happy to take any questions then. Thank you.
All right, so now we do have quite a few questions that have come in through Menti already. So just if you haven't already, go ahead and enter those now. And we're going to go to these questions because we do have a virtual presenter online. I'm going to help with some of the Q&A, but I'll start with our first presenters, Dan and Tiffany, while we're getting warmed up here. If you see any on the screen that you're ready to answer, feel free to restate the question and answer. Otherwise, I'll start reading them all. So I'll start with you, Dan. It says, Dan Rizza noted that the NOAA technical report stated that we should expect 10 to 12 inches of rise locked in by mid-century. What's the starting point from which that 10 to 12 inches is estimated? Is that current conditions or? Yeah, could you turn his mic on, please?
Can you hear me? Okay,
Yes.
Yeah, from today's levels, there are lots of web tools out there where you can visualize what this means for you. So you can go to NOAA's tools. They have a sea level change viewer. They have a coastal flood exposure mapper, and we have our coastal risk screening tool. So you could, I see there's a question about a local home. You can zoom in to your home and take a look at what 10 to 12 inches looks like based on different scenarios there. And I've seen people reach out to NOAA and us asking for detailed questions. So happy to field questions after you take a look at our maps.
It says, how can communities with gravity-based systems best retrofit using sea level rise with sea levels rising?
Yeah, so we have a web tool out there. You can go check out the different solutions in there that talk about what other groups are doing. I'd actually recommend you talk to some of the resilience officials and resilience experts here in the room who are more familiar with what's going on in Florida. There's a lot going on in Florida. We were very impressed by what we saw when we were driving down the coastline. So I would defer to them on those details. Should I take that one? How do you see policymakers receiving the data to affect positive policy change? We've had experience. We have this flood visualization technology where we have kind of a Google Street View for flooding. We drive down the street and we're capturing the elevation data with LiDAR and cameras, and we can create photorealistic visuals of flood risk. And so the question that most people have when I present on this is, and we worked with the Northeast Florida Regional Council, Farah Alami, did a project with them funded by Florida Sea Grant a while back, and we presented at one of their public meetings, and there were elected officials there from across the political spectrum, and those visuals and the data prompted really useful discussions about what it meant for building codes or encouraging people to evacuate. I think every week we see lots of mayors and elected officials included downloading our maps and visuals to use them within their own resilience work. So there's we see lots of very tangible examples of people using this to communicate to their constituents about the need for building codes or to get points within the community rating system. There are different economic and financial incentives that can be used and to kind of encourage, and lots of the science and data and tools can be used to give you additional materials for that.
It's like now we have some for Tiffany. Is there one there that jumps out at you that you'd like to start with?
There are a lot of great questions. Wow. Yeah, I mean, I can speak to, I don't know.
If you want to restate.
Jennifer, you see any really key questions you want to just?
I mean, there are a lot of good ones. So the first one at the top says, how can we convince to protect wetlands instead of paving them? Obviously, you highlighted the important role and are educating us about all the values that wetlands present in protecting both. And I think that is something that we've struggled with and trying to ensure that wetlands are seen as valuable and that we can provide incentives and compensation for their protection. Did you have anything else you would like to add on that?
I think it's to answer. I think it's about leadership. It's about public engagement, and wetlands are our life in Florida. So I think it's in part about leadership. It cuts to the National Science Foundation. Yeah, I mean, we were lucky enough to have our Florida Coastal Everglades Long-Term Ecological Research Program refunded, but we don't know what the long-term outcome will be in terms of following year's budget will look like for that science. The LTR is open 100% to collaborating with institutions that have students that are interested in conducting work in the Everglades. So please just reach out to me. I can connect you with opportunities there. Yeah, I think the question about planting mango as a way to jumpstart adaptation is a really interesting question, and I hope that I mean, in part, it's important to understand what those existing conditions are, what that environment looks like, and what the outcome that is intended. So I would say it's probably a site-specific assessment before doing something like that. But I consider the Mimi project. I'd be happy to talk with anyone about that. It might be interested in learning more about the specifics there.
There's one about, do you support the current Everglades restoration plan? Will it be a net positive for the Caloosahatchee River? Do you have any comments with your experience working on Everglades restoration?
Well, we've seen more progress than we have in a long time, so I think that's very positive. I'm not as familiar with the intricacies of the issues with the Caloosahatchee, so forgive me there.
Well, we just did have the C-43 ribbon cutting, and it will
I did
be
see that in the
operational
news.
soon.
Yeah.
That is the reservoir that is situated along the Caloosahatchee to take some of the from the river and then pulse them back to the river during the dry season when the river does need additional freshwater flow. So while it's not yet operational, we're very excited that it will be soon, and we to the Caloosahatchee and reducing the amount of times when it is right now not receiving sufficient minimum flows. Are there any others on this? If not, we can scroll down a little bit. See the next row. Is there any modeling from how sea level rise will inundate mangroves, where red mangroves in particular and hardened seawalls exist? Are there any potential mitigation strategies in place, such as tiered walls with mangroves? Any of your experiences, Tiffany, on that one?
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with modeling work where the built and natural infrastructure is being considered together. I am aware of some strategies where using tiered walls with mangroves. I think there's at least one or two small companies that are trying to promote those types of mitigation strategies. But I don't think we have a whole lot of information about that performance over the long term.
There is a question in the lower right that says, Tiffany, is that what you see on the edges of estuaries, or are they the ones that are surrounded by water?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, the scrub mangroves, they have a lot of below mass, so very productive below ground, and they can be quite old. And they are more short in stature, either as a result of low nutrient availability in the soils or exposure to natural toxins like sulfide, which can reduce plant growth. And so they are, you do generally see them in areas with more open water, but they pretty quickly in some areas of the Everglades, and we could probably see them, quite a bit of them around.
It says, why are we still using the 1983 to 2001 National Tidal Data epoch? Can it be updated to show a more current, accurate forecast?
I think that one's for Brian or Dan. Yeah.
I can probably answer that thing. As I mentioned, it is updated roughly every 20 years. and it's in the process of being updated now. They currently expect, they just say sometime after 2026 it will be updated, at which point it would be a 2002 to 2020. That would be the next update, which unfortunately means that as soon as it's released, it's already out of date because there has been sea level rise since that. But it does bring it more up to date. And that's just the leapfrog game that's played roughly in a year to two, perhaps.
There's a question, besides sea level rise, what other anthropogenic and ocean factors are considered in the SMART tide forecasts? Does it consider wind-driven tide?
Yeah, I mentioned that in one of the slides. So there, we do take into account ocean temperature, significant wave height, which is forecast by the models, and that's kind of a proxy for if there is a storm well offshore, or a wind-driven swell sort of thing, that definitely affects it. So we take that into account. So yes, it does consider wind. It does consider ocean temperature, which definitely has an influence, and ocean swell. Ingredients in it, there's a bit more to it, but those, to basically provide an answer to that question, yes, it does consider wind-driven tide.
Okay. How do we develop better models for the Gulf Coast, or is that necessary?
It is necessary. I think it would be great to improve the skill. As I mentioned, our forecasts do still have skill out to 10 days, even on the West Coast. It's just less skill than the East Coast. And I think the tides along the West Coast are just more with the tides in the Gulf is just more complex than it is on the East Coast. And so I think our model is basically reflecting that. There's just a bit more complexity to it. So it's something we've been thinking about since this all began. So yeah, that is still definitely an active question. Thank you.
I see of the 10-day predictions, and what is the track record?
So we consider the baseline to be the NOAA tide predictions with a sea level rise adjustment. So we're not creating our skill based on what we know to be a very outdated tide prediction, using the 1983 to 2001 baseline. We're taking that, updating it to what basically current sea level is, and that's what we can evaluate our skill against. And it has skill, depends on which site you're looking at. Sometimes 50% plus skill at the first few days, down to maybe 10 to 20% skill by day 10. The track record is basically that. It didn't have really time. We're not ready with a full model verification yet, but we do look at it routinely, and the track record is good. So like I say, we're depending on the site, it's 50 to days 1, 2, and down to 10 to 20% by days 9 and 10. It
says, have you thought about retrieving from areas that are prone to flooding, sea level rise, and storm surge? When do we consider this as an option?
Retreating.
Who is that directed to?
I think that might have been to you, but I am maybe looking at real, I think with all models, we calibrate based on real life data that's collected through these, high water events and hurricanes and whatnot. And so if any of you have any comments on that, on how you utilize information that is being gathered from these events.
I think you could just look for whatever data is available. Certain regions have more data. There are also groups out there developing their own sensors, local sensors that can be what sensors are for tide data. So there's some really innovative work being done.
Great.
Yeah. Yeah, to get into that really local level, it's hard. And that actually relates to a question I see to the right of that is, can we get smart tide forecast for Charlotte Harbor? These models are trained on historical tide gauge data. So you have to measurements to be able to predict the future. That's kind of how they learn what environmental factors do what. And so for Charlotte Harbor, no, we don't have that. You'd use the Fort Myers gauge and the forecast made there to get an idea of when to expect extremely high tides.
Okay. Dr. Troxler, how do you think the resilience of coastal wetland storm of the accelerated sea level rise?
Yeah, that is a great question. We do have some research that illustrates for some mangrove systems where when you do have a large sediment deposition event from storm surge, that can have the impact of fertilizing those mangroves, which can allow them to recover more quickly. And I think it depends on the intensity of the wind. But storm surge can actually have an effect of promoting the recovery of mangrove systems in some conditions.
And then is, what direction should future research take? What are some key questions that still need addressing?
Well, I think lots of groups are looking at compound flood risk, right? I know groups in the Water Institute and more advanced models, so that's really interesting and worth tracking. That's what comes to mind.
Yeah, and I think what was raised earlier about looking at the performance of integrated natural hard infrastructure is something we don't know as much about and could benefit from, especially since we know that adaptation measures do need to be specific to the site.
And then speaking of adaptation measures, there's one there. Dan and Tiffany, what adaptation approaches do you suggest to address overlapping risks, such as improving groundwater resiliency while mitigating flooding?
Well, I'll just say that we also have to look inland. You know, the protection and promotion of the health of coastal wetlands is in large part how we develop or what other types of strategies in the watershed. So we really have to think about it as an integrated approach.
Well, with that, we're at time. Thank you very much for your presentations.